Welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades, aka Jesse Colbertic, here again at your service with another exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for none other than Meta Platforms. That's right, Proxyopolis. Following the Proxyopoly score for Deutsche Bank, BlackRock, Tesla, Walmart. What was the last one again? Oh yeah, ExxonMobil. We now have on the docket today the Proxyopoly score for Meta. And so without any further delay, the Proxyopoly score for Meta. Part 1. Proxyopoly TM score, explanation and overview. Looking into the Proxyopoly TM framework, the Proxyopoly TM score is a composite metric assessing how heavily a company's governance is tilted toward entrenched control and away from shareholder accountability. It is derived from 5 underlying Proxyopoly TM ratings, each measured on a beta-style scale, similar to a stock's beta in the measurement of volatility. On this scale, however, 0.00 is neutral. Negative values beneath that indicate structures that favor shareholder rights or democratic governance. And positive values on this scale indicate entrenchment, insider dominance, or volatility beyond the norm. Scores can fall below negative 0.5, meaning a highly shareholder-friendly or open governance structure, or final Proxyopoly scores above positive 1.00, meaning extremely entrenched or unaccountable governance, depending on how far the company deviates from market norms. And here are the 5 underlying Proxyopoly TM ratings and a brief description of them before we dive into the roast of Meta Platforms. I mean, the Proxyopoly TM score for Meta. The first Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the Proxy Accumulation Resistance, or PAR for an acronym. PAR measures how difficult it is for outside shareholders to accumulate enough proxies to influence corporate decisions. The second Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the Bylaw Fortification Index, or BFI, assessing the degree to which the company's charter or bylaws insulate management via dual-class stock, poison pills, supermajority requirements, etc. The third Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the Shareholder Hostility Quotient, or SHQ for an acronym. Shareholder Hostility Quotient gauges management's attitude toward shareholder input. For example, receptiveness to proposals, engagement, or general obstruction tactics, just to name a few. The fourth Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the Executive Entrenchment Factor, or acronym EEF. EEF evaluates how securely the executive leadership, especially chair CEOs, insulate themselves from removal or oversight concerning the consideration of role concentration, tenure, succession planning, etc. The fifth Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the regulatory evasion measure, or REM for short. Regulatory evasion measure captures how effectively the company evades or influences regulatory oversight through lobbying, legal loopholes, jurisdictional arbitrage, etc. Meta's Proxyopoly TM score. We will be looking at Meta Platforms, one of the world's most influential technology companies. The Proxyopoly TM analysis in this proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report reveals a governance structure heavily dominated by founder control, fortified against external challenge, and often resistant to outside accountability. Meta's final Proxyopoly TM score, to be revealed at the end of the episode, is calculated as the average weighted of the 5 previously mentioned Proxyopoly TM ratings. Each Proxyopoly TM rating is assigned with 2 decimal precision, down to the hundredths. And the final Proxyopoly TM composite score is rounded to 2 decimals. Below, or the following, represents a summary of Meta's Proxyopoly TM ratings, for which we will count the weighted average for a final Proxyopoly TM score to be revealed at the end of the episode. In Proxyopoly's initial interpretation of Meta Platforms, Meta's final Proxyopoly score, to be revealed at the end of the episode, places it firmly in the camp of companies with concentrated power and low shareholder influence. This score is on the high end of the spectrum, believe it or not, Proxyopolis, despite how low it may appear nominally, but decimally compared to or exceeding other famously founder-controlled firms. It reflects the reality that Meta's founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, maintains ironclad control over the company's direction, a situation enabled by the corporate architecture and policies discussed in detail in the next section of this podcast. In practical terms, a Proxyopoly score from Meta, to be revealed at the end of this episode, indicates that Meta has drifted far from the one share, one vote democratic ownership norms, with governance practices that favor insider dominance and make external accountability extremely difficult. Investors and board observers should understand that such a score by Proxyopoly TM means Meta Platforms has drifted far from, quote, one share, one vote, unquote, democratic ownership norms, with governance practices that favor insider dominance and make external accountability extremely difficult. Investors and board observers should understand that such a Proxyopoly TM score signifies elevated risk of unchecked decision-making and challenges for minority shareholders seeking influence. In the following parts and sections of this podcast, we will delve into each of the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings listed for Meta. We will examine how Meta's handling of AI ethics, data privacy, misinformation, and control structures contribute to these Proxyopoly TM ratings and provide evidence with subsequent analysis for each. This will set the stage for part 3 of this podcast, where Proxyopoly TM presents recommendations to address these governance issues and specific voting guidance for Meta's board of directors at its upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Before we dive into part 2, the detailed analysis of each Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score for Meta, we'd like to give a quick shout out for all the sponsors that make Proxyopoly TM possible. While Proxyopoly TM has plenty of time on its podcasts for sponsored content and contributed content, Proxyopoly TM ain't about that pay-to-play bullshit. However, I will give a quick shout-out to all the family members who make this possible in memoriam to my Uncle Clyde, who passed away recently, and my uncles and aunts, cousins and kin have been very supportive of my voice in recent years. And once again, I would be remiss if I didn't dedicate just a little piece of this time just to give them a quick shout out before we get into part 2 with the Proxy Accumulation Resistance, or PAR, which measures the difficulty outside shareholders face in amassing enough proxy voting power through share accumulation or proxy fights to influence board composition or strategic decisions. In essence, it evaluates how insulated the company is from shareholder activism via ownership structure. Factors include insider ownership concentration, dual-class share dynamics, passive investor voting behavior, and the historical success or failure rate of activist campaigns. Meta's proxy accumulation rating of negative 0.75 is a deeply negative PAR, signifying that Meta is essentially a, quote, proxy fortress, unquote, an impregnable stronghold against outside shareholder control. At negative 0.75, Meta's proxy accumulation resistance is well beyond the, quote, high resistance, unquote, band, and firmly in the territory where proxy challenges are virtually impossible to win. Several aspects of Meta's ownership and voting structure drive this formidable resistance, and they are as follows. Dual-class stock with insider majority. Meta Platform's capital structure is deliberately designed to concentrate voting power in Mark Zuckerberg's hands. The company has 2 classes of common stock. Class A, 1 vote per share held by public investors, and Class B shares, 10 votes per share, largely held by Zuckerberg and a few insiders. Mark Zuckerberg owns about 99.7% of Class B voting shares, giving him roughly 61% of total voting rights, despite owning far less of the economic equity. This voting power imbalance means Zuck by himself can dictate the outcome of any shareholder vote. For example, through this dual-class mechanism, he controls roughly 58 to 61% of votes while holding only 14% of Meta's equity. This one fact towers over all others in explaining Meta's proxy accumulation resistance. No outside correlation can outvote the founder, no matter how large, making effective proxy accumulation by others practically futile. Another aspect of Meta's ownership and voting structure driving the proxy accumulation resistance rating is the concentrated insider control history. Since going public, Meta, formerly Facebook, has never had a moment where outside investors could credibly threaten management's control via proxy voting. No activist investor has ever launched a proxy contest for board seats at Meta, and with good reason. The structural odds are insurmountable. Even if an activist acquired a significant economic stake, they would be buying Class A shares with diluted voting power, and Zuckerberg's Class B stake would still allow him to veto any board change or hostile takeover attempt. In the rare cases where large shareholders have tried to organize or push for change, calling governance reforms, etc., their efforts have largely been symbolic protests rather than true attempts to win a vote, because everyone recognizes that Meta's board and leadership are elected essentially at Zuckerberg's discretion. Another aspect of Meta's ownership and voting structure driving the proxy accumulation resistance rating is the passive investor voting inertia. Compounding the dual-class structure, a large portion of Meta's publicly traded shares are held by passive index funds and institutional investors such as Vanguard and BlackRock. These institutions often vote with management on routine matters or follow proxy advisor guidelines. But even when they dissent, their impact is diluted. For instance, at Meta's 2024 annual meeting, numerous shareholder proposals from independent investors were on the ballot, ranging from governance changes to social issues. A majority of non-insider shareholders often vote for reforms. But Zuckerberg's controlling stake means the proposals still fail. The recent case in 2024 is telling. A proposal to simply disclose voting results broken out by share class to increase transparency about how often Class B stock thwarts Class A's will won 55% support among Class A shareholders, yet was defeated because Zuckerberg's Class B votes counted overwhelmingly against it. I won't get into the math here, but you can see how 55% of Class A share votes are a majority, and with 45% diluted down to, say, if what's supposed to be 10 votes per share, you can get the numbers in your head of how egregious it is that Zuckerberg has 10 votes per share to override the will of shareholders who just want transparency in how all class shares are voted. This act illustrates how even unanimous support from every other shareholder group would be insufficient if Zuckerberg disagrees. Traditional corporate governance levers like engaging large institutional investors to vote as a bloc are largely moot in Meta's case. Another aspect of Meta's ownership and voting structure driving the proxy accumulation resistance is the historical lack of proxy contests. Looking back at Meta's history, there have been 0 successful proxy fights or hostile takeover attempts. Activist investors tend to avoid companies where the deck is stacked against them. The absence of activist campaigns in Meta is itself evident of the extreme proxy accumulation resistance. There is an understood futility in trying to challenge the board via proxy vote when one man holds majority control. Even during periods when Meta's share price lagged or the company was mired in controversy, for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal or Facebook Papers revelations, no outside investor could leverage those crises into board changes or leadership turnover because the voting power simply wasn't available. Another aspect of Meta's ownership and voting structure driving the proxy accumulation resistance is the insider alignment with voting blocs. Aside from Zuckerberg's dominance, Meta's insiders and loyalists, including early investors and executives, historically have tended to vote in line with him. Zuckerberg's 61% is enough to win on its own. In practice, he often can count on even higher combined insider voter support. This creates a near monolithic voting bloc. The, quote, free float, unquote, of votes truly up for grabs in any proxy contest is extremely small. Once you factor out insider holdings and the high likelihood that passive funds won't rebel in large enough numbers. In short, the realistic, achievable vote share for any dissident shareholder resolution or slate is far below the threshold needed to win. Taken together, these factors justify Meta's proxy accumulation resistance rating of negative 0.75. The company's governance is a textbook case of a fortified proxy fortress. The ramparts are the dual-class shares and Zuckerberg's majority stake, which repel any assault on control. Outside, shareholders face extraordinary difficulty in influencing even modest governance changes through voting. As a result, Meta's proxy accumulation resistance is deeply negative, reflecting a level of resistance to shareholder-led changes that is backed into the corporate DNA. This entrenched position comes at a cost. It means traditional shareholder democracy is essentially nullified at Meta platforms. For context, very few public companies in the S&P 500 have a single individual with majority voting control. Meta Platforms is an outlier, akin to a private fiefdom within a public company shell. The next sections of this podcast will show you how this extreme proxy accumulation resistance works in concert with other mechanisms to solidify management's power. The next Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the Bylaw Fortification Index, which evaluates how the company's formal governance rules, bylaws, charter provisions, and structural mechanisms fortify management against shareholder intervention. This includes anti-takeover devices and procedural hurdles such as classified boards, supermajority voting requirements, poison pill plans, limits on shareholders' ability to call meetings or nominate directors, and of course, dual-class share structures. A high BFI, Bylaw Fortification Index, means the company has put in place a thick legal armor that makes it very hard for shareholders to enact changes even if they have concerns. Meta's BFI rating of positive 0.90 indicates a hardened structure. Meta's BFI is markedly high, approaching the corporate minefield category. A Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.90 for the Bylaw Fortification Index indicates that Meta's governance framework is heavily fortified in favor of incumbent control. In Meta's case, one structural feature above all drives this rating: the dual-class share structure with no sunset provision, which is an extremely powerful charter provision insulating management. However, there are additional governance aspects to consider in the Bylaw Fortification Index, namely perpetual dual-class voting rights. Meta's charter established two classes of stock, A and B, with unequal voting rights from the outset. Unlike some dual-class companies that include a sunset clause or provision requiring the supervoting shares to expire after X amount of years or when the founder's stake falls below a threshold, Meta's dual-class share structure, however, is permanent unless changed by a shareholder vote, which ironically Zuckerberg can block with the very super votes at issue. In recent years, shareholder advocacy groups and some investors have pushed for a, quote, one share, one vote, unquote, at Meta, but the board and management have staunchly opposed these efforts. In the 2025 Proxy statement, Meta's board explicitly urged shareholders to reject a proposal to eliminate the dual-class share structure, arguing that founder control is essential for long-term stability. This intransigence on dual-class preservation is a key reason Meta's Bylaw Fortification Index is near the top of the scale. The company is essentially saying no to aligning its proxy voting structure with typical shareholder democratic norms. The dual-class structure by itself serves as a poison pill against shareholder activism. Any attempt to change fundamental governance, like amending bylaws or ousting directors, would require overcoming the weighted voting. Thus, the charter is constructed to entrench. Meta's stance is that this structure allows it to resist short-term pressures and pursue visionary bets. They cite peers like Google and Snap also have dual-class controlled voting shares, but from a Proxyopoly TM perspective, it's a clear fortification of insider power. Another governance aspect to consider in the Bylaw Fortification Index is the supermajority requirements and voting rules. Given the dual-class voting shares, even ordinary majority voting requirements become in effect supermajority hurdles for Class A shareholders. Certain fundamental changes, such as amending charter bylaws, mergers, or removal of a director, typically require a high voting threshold or separate class votes. In Meta's case, any proposal to alter voting rights or other charter provisions would require approval of Class B shares controlled by Zuckerberg, effectively a built-in veto. Additionally, if Meta's bylaws had any clauses like requiring over 50% or two-thirds majority approval for certain actions, those are trivial for Zuckerberg to meet with his 61% Class B shares. From minority shareholders' perspective, these are insurmountable thresholds. The outcome is the same. The rules ensure that no change can happen without insider concurrence. One striking example in 2023, a proposal simply to require the company to report voting results, factoring out the dual-class distortion, essentially providing a true picture of independent shareholder sentiment, failed at the shareholder meeting, even though it was just a transparency measure, demonstrating how locked down the system is. Another aspect to consider in the Bylaw Fortification Index are the limits on shareholder rights. Aside from voting power, Meta's governance is set up to place limits on other avenues of shareholder action. Another aspect to consider in the Bylaw Fortification Index is no cumulative voting for directors. Meta does not allow cumulative voting, which could have given minority shareholders a slightly better chance to elect at least one director by pooling votes. The absence of cumulative voting is standard for many companies, but in combination with dual class, it means even proportional representation on the board is out of reach for minority shareholders. Special meeting and action by written consent are another factor to consider in Meta's Bylaw Fortification Index, whereas Meta's charter reportedly does not empower minority shareholders to call special shareholder meetings or to act by written consent without an overwhelming percentage. In many companies, holders of 10 to 25% of shares can call a special meeting. At Meta, even if such provisions exist on paper, Class B shares make it moot, since Zuckerberg alone crosses any threshold for majority. In practice, only Zuckerberg can effectively call a meeting or initiate consent solicitations that have any force, which again solidifies insider control. Another factor to take into consideration for the Bylaw Fortification Index for Meta is the proxy access for nomination. Some companies have adopted, quote, proxy access, unquote, bylaws, allowing significant long-term shareholders to nominate directors on the company's proxy card. Meta has a proxy access provision adopted in 2016 that lets a shareholder or group owning 3% of stock for 3 years nominate up to 20% of the board. However, given the vote dynamics, even if used, a proxy access nominee would almost certainly fail to get elected without Zuckerberg support. It is a window dressing fortification. The structure technically permits shareholder nominees, but the controller votes ensure those nominees do not win. Thus, while Meta can claim it has modern governance features like proxy access, the effectiveness of such measures is nullified by the overarching voting control. Another factor to take into consideration for the Bylaw Fortification Index is the board structure and committees. Interestingly, Meta's board is not classified as staggered. All directors stand for election annually, which is generally considered shareholder-friendly feature. However, in Meta's case, annual elections do not equate to accountability, since elections are perfunctory when the outcome is preordained by majority votes. The lack of a staggered board slightly lowers the BFI. If Meta also had a staggered board, it would even be more fortified, potentially pushing BFI above positive 1.0 in minefield territory. Additionally, Meta has formed various committees: audit, compensation, governance, privacy, compliance, ostensibly to provide oversight, but the effectiveness of these committees is constrained by the board's loyalty to Zuckerberg and the limited powers they have. For example, the Privacy Committee was created pursuant to a Federal Trade Commission order, but it operates under the board that Mark Zuckerberg chairs. Another aspect to take into consideration for the Bylaw Fortification Index are the demonstrated resistance to bylaw changes. Empirical evidence of Meta's fortified bylaws can be seen in the outcomes of the following shareholder votes. In 2022, shareholders put forth a proposal on the ballot to eliminate the dual-class share structure, collapse Class B shares into Class A shares. This is a direct challenge to the key fortification. Not surprisingly, the board opposed it and it failed, but tellingly, it garnered over 80% of the non-insider votes. Independent investors knew it was important. The only reason it did not pass is because Zuckerberg's Class B votes count more. This underscores how the bylaws protect insiders. The dual class feature can only be removed by a vote that the dual class feature itself makes impossible without insider approval. Another example in 2024, as mentioned, a proposal to empower the lead independent director, namely Robert Kimmett, to unilaterally add agenda items for board meetings to ensure the board can discuss issues even if the chair doesn't want to, got 60% of outside shareholder support. This was a fairly modest governance tweak, yet because it required a charter and a bylaw change, Zuckerberg's opposition meant it failed. The board's default slate remains that the chair CEO fully controls the agenda. The inability of shareholders to enact even this minor change speaks volumes. Meta's governance can withstand a majority outside pressure and remain unchanged. In sum, Meta's Bylaw Fortification Index of positive 0.90 reflects a governance architecture deliberately built to entrench. The combination of perpetual dual-class supervoting stock, lack of meaningful minority rights, and a track record of rejecting shareholder-led bylaw reforms creates a nearly unassailable fortress around management. While just shy of the above positive 1.00 corporate minefield label, since Meta doesn't employ certain other defenses like a staggered board or a poison pill at the present moment. In practical effect, Meta's structure is a hard line as it gets in large public companies. The company argues that this structure allows it to pursue long-term initiatives like its metaverse and AI ambitions without distraction. However, the downside is a lack of accountability. The usual checks and balances that bylaws provide at other companies are largely absent here. Meta's governance framework provides minimal openings for shareholder influence, contributing to an overarching environment of insider dominance. Moving on to the third Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score, we're going to talk about the Shareholder Hostility Quotient, or acronym SHQ. By definition, Shareholder Hostility Quotient measures the degree to which a company's leadership and processes are hostile or receptive to shareholder engagement. Unlike Proxy Accumulation Resistance and Bylaw Fortification Index, which are structural, SHQ focuses on behavioral and procedural factors. How management responds to shareholder proposals, whether it actively engages with or stonewalls investors, the tone of communications, and any tactics used to undermine dissent. For example, delaying shareholder meetings, excluding proposals from shareholder meetings, or framing shareholder requests as nuances. A high positive SHQ would indicate a management culture that views shareholder input as unwelcome, often evidenced by consistently opposing shareholder initiatives, limited communication, and perhaps using the rules to disadvantage shareholder rights. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM has assigned a Proxyopoly TM rating for Meta's Shareholder Hostility Quotient of positive 1.30, putting it in defensive to hostile territory. This is a very elevated shareholder hostility quotient, exceeding positive 1.00, which means Meta falls in the hostile territory range, where shareholder rights or voices are treated as a threat or annoyance. In practical terms, Meta's management has a history of resisting external shareholder influence, not just through structure, but through attitude and action. Key observations underpinning this rating include routine opposition to shareholder proposals. Meta's management and board routinely recommend voting against all significant shareholder-sponsored proposals, even those with broad support or concerning widely acknowledged issues such as transparency, equity, or risk oversight. For example, proposals calling for an independent board chair, reports on online harms, political spending transparency, or enhanced shareholder rights have appeared on Meta's ballot year after year. The board stance has been uniformly negative. In 2022, the proxy statement included a shareholder proposal to install an independent chair separating the roles of CEO and chairperson, Mark Zuckerberg. The board opposed it, and thanks to Zuckerberg's vote, it was defeated. Likewise, proposals regarding dual-class share structure, as discussed, are opposed. There is effectively a policy of zero concessions to shareholder-driven governance reforms. This signals a management philosophy that shareholder initiatives are to be blocked, not embraced, regardless of merit. When 92% of Meta's non-insider shareholders in 2022 signaled displeasure with Zuckerberg's leadership in various votes, including likely the independent chair proposal and a possibility of a say-on-pay vote, nothing in management's approach changed. Such overwhelming outside feedback would cause many boards to at least engage in dialogue or make good faith gestures, but Meta's leadership remained unmoved, a clear hallmark of a hostile stance towards shareholder input. Another observation underpinning the Proxyopoly TM rating of the shareholder hostility quotient is Meta's dismissive tone and messaging. The tone that Meta's leadership takes in public filings and statements regarding shareholder suggestions often veers toward dismissive. In the 2025 proxy statement materials, for instance, the board characterized the proposal to eliminate dual-class shares as something that would undermine stability and long-term vision, implicitly suggesting shareholders pushing it were short-sighted. Another example, Meta's response to a proposal for greater transparency on how dual-class votes distort outcomes was to label it redundant, because the company believed it already provided sufficient information. This despite clear investor interest in understanding the true level of dissent being masked. Such language, calling a shareholder concern redundant or unnecessary, indicates a lack of respect for the perspective of outside investors. Furthermore, when Meta faced calls to improve oversight of content moderation and misinformation after events like the 2016 election interference and Cambridge Analytica controversies, the leadership's response was to create an oversight board, an external advisory body, but frame many shareholder proposals on these issues as unnecessary or, quote, already addressed, unquote. Essentially, the company often communicates that, quote, we know best, and formal shareholder requests add no value, unquote. This paternalistic approach hallmarks the essence of this shareholder hostility quotient for Meta. Management does not actively welcome stockholder input unless it aligns with their pre-existing plans. Another observation to take into consideration for the shareholder hostility quotient is engagement versus evasion at Meta. Companies with the low or negative shareholder hostility quotient will proactively engage large shareholders, hold meetings to discuss concerns, and sometimes negotiate to avoid confrontation at annual general meetings. Meta's records here is sparse. While Meta's investor relations does hold earnings calls and occasional investor days focused on business results, there is little evidence of robust engagement with shareholders on governance or environmental, social, and governance issues. Major institutional investors and pension funds have publicly criticized Meta's governance. For instance, calling for one share, one vote, or better handling of misinformation and user harms. Meta's typical response, however, is not a collaborative meeting or policy change, but rather a polite rebuff. The culture set from the top by Zuckerberg himself has historically been one of insularity. Focus on product and vision and treat outside advice, even from shareholders, with skepticism unless it aligns with internal views. Reports from stewardship teams and asset managers indicate that dialogues with Meta on governance have not borne fruit. The company line doesn't budge. In contrast, some other tech companies under pressure have made concessions. Twitter agreed to some disclosure changes when it faced shareholder proposals pre-2022, before it was X. Meta stands out for rarely, if ever, yielding to shareholder pressure. Another observation underpinning the shareholder hostility quotient Proxyopoly TM rating include the use of procedural tactics. In terms of the mechanics of annual general meetings, Meta adheres to legal requirements, but arguably has used the structure to dismiss shareholder influence. The very fact that shareholder proposals are bundled into annual meetings where Zuck's votes doom them is itself a tactic. Meta has not offered to implement if majority of minority approves or any such gesture. Additionally, until 2022, Meta's annual meetings were chaired by Mark Zuckerberg, as is right by chair, who controlled the Q&A process as well. There have been instances where the company's handling of AGM Q&A came under criticism. For example, questions about sensitive topics sometimes being paraphrased or combined, limiting opportunity for direct challenge. While not overly abusive, these subtleties contribute to an atmosphere where dissenting voices struggle to get traction. No shareholder proposal has ever been approved over board opposition, even those that got significant support from Class A shareholders. Management has maintained a perfect record of resistance. Another observation underpinning the shareholder hostility quotient is the board agenda control, a case study. A particularly illustrative case of Meta's hostility to ceding any ground, the 2024 resolution to empower the lead independent director, an existing board member tasked with representing independent shareholders' interests, to have the authority to place items on the board's agenda without needing this chair/CEO's consent. This is an internal governance tweak intended to ensure the board can discuss issues that concern independent directors. One might think management could agree to this in spirit of good governance, but Meta opposed it strongly. And Mark Zuckerberg's vote alone killed it. The proposal was initiated by a shareholder and institutional investor coalition precisely because they perceived that Meta's board only talks about what Mark wants to talk about. The board, with Mark Zuckerberg at the helm, refused to yield even this minor concession. This indicates a high level of defensiveness toward any mechanism that empowers directors not handpicked by Mark Zuckerberg. In other words, management appears to guard its control over even the boardroom discussion topics, reflecting an ingrained hostility to power sharing of any kind. Another observation underpinning the shareholder hostility quotient is the rejection of environmental, social governance, or ethics-related requests. Over the past few years, Meta has faced intense public scrutiny over data privacy lapses, the spread of misinformation, hate speech on its platforms, and the potential harms of its algorithms, especially to young users. Shareholders concerned with these issues have filed proposals asking Meta to produce reports on online child safety, to undergo third-party audits of its content moderation effectiveness, to consider linking executive pay to ESG metrics, etc. Meta's responses have almost uniformly been, quote, vote against, we are already doing enough, unquote. For instance, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, a proposal in 2019 asked for an external review of the company's data privacy policies. Management said no, citing improvements that they were making internally. In 2021, after the whistleblower Frances Haugen's revelations about Instagram's impact on teen mental health, shareholders proposed a content risk oversight committee at the board level. Again, Meta's board said that this was unnecessary because they claimed existing initiatives sufficed. The pattern is clear. The default answer to shareholder ideas is no. The company's unwillingness to even try a shareholder-suggested approach like setting up a new committee suggests it perceives such suggestions as interference rather than constructive input. Considering these points, Meta's shareholder hostility quotient of positive 1.30 is well justified. Meta exhibits traits of management team that, if not outright antagonistic in rhetoric, is highly unresponsive and consistently resistant to shareholder influence. The, quote, shareholder voice, unquote, is marginalized in Meta's governance. In practical terms, the only shareholder whose voice truly matters is Zucks. The structure makes that literally true. And the behavior of the company reinforces it by sidelining others. The high shareholder hostility quotient signals risk. Important external perspectives, for example, warnings about platform misuse or calls for governance reform, can be too easily ignored, potentially to the detriment of long-term shareholder value. A more engaged, lower shareholder hostility quotient approach might push Meta to address issues proactively, like privacy or content moderation, rather than reactively, but the current culture doesn't foster that. Instead, shareholders often find themselves shouting into the wind, with management deaf-eared thanks to its insular confidence and voting control. Moving on to the fourth Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the executive entrenchment factor, or EEF. By definition, executive entrenchment factor, EEF, assesses how strongly the CEO and top executives are insulated from accountability and replacement, beyond what is normal or healthy in corporate governance. Key considerations include the CEO's tenure and dominance, whether the CEO also chairs the board in a concentration of roles, the independence and refreshment of the board relative to management, the existence of a clear succession plan, any evidence that even poor performance or scandals do not result in leadership changes. A high EEF suggests an organization where top executives exert outsized control and are virtually irreplaceable, indicating a power imbalance between the CEO, the board, the chairperson, if a different person, and shareholders at large. For Meta's executive entrenchment factor, Proxyopoly TM has assigned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.90, noting extreme entrenchment, autocratic executive power. This Proxyopoly TM rating exceeds the 1 positive mark of the scale, reflecting that Mark Zuckerberg is essentially untouchable as Meta's chief executive. Meta is a paradigmatic case of founder entrenchment. The founder has solidified his role as perpetual leader, and traditional mechanisms that might challenge or check his authority are ineffective. Several factors contributing to this very high executive entrenchment factor include a founder CEO with over 20 years at the helm, namely Mark Zuckerberg, who founded Facebook in 2004, has led the company ever since for 21 years and counting. Such a lengthy CEO tenure is unusual in the S&P 500 and significantly exceeds the 10-year mark as cited for concern for fresh leadership. Throughout this period, Zuck has never indicated any willingness to cede the CEO role. There is no publicly known CEO succession plan. The company has not groomed a clear heir apparent, and Mark has no signals of preparing one. In fact, when longtime COO Sheryl Sandberg was still with Meta, some speculated that she could be a successor, but her departure in 2022 left no obvious second-in-command with the stature to take over. Zuckerberg's personal control is reinforced by his youth. He is still only in his late 30s, and his public statements that imply he intends to lead Meta for decades. His focus on, quote, the long term, unquote, suggests he sees himself steering that ship long term. In short, the CEO seat is Mark's for as long as he desires, with no internal timeline or process to rotate leadership. Another factor contributing to the executive entrenchment factor includes dual role as chairperson and CEO. Mark Zuckerberg is not only the CEO, the top manager, but also the chairperson of the board of directors. This dual concentration of roles gives him enormous influence over the board's agenda, discussions, and decisions. As both CEO and chair, Zuckerberg effectively oversees himself. There is no independent board leader with the authority to truly supervise or evaluate the CEO. Meta's board has appointed a lead independent director, namely Robert Kimmett, since 2020, who has some limited duties, like presiding over executive sessions of independent directors. However, as evidenced by earlier discussions, even the lead independent director cannot add items to the board agenda without Mark's agreement, a structural quirk Meta refused to change. The combination of CEO and chair in a controlled company means the classic balance of power is absent. Typically, a board can fire a CEO or push for changes, but here the CEO and chair controls who is on the board through his majority vote, and what the board talks about as well. This is hallmark of autocratic executive power. On the executive entrenchment factor scale, the removal of the CEO is virtually impossible. When the CEO chairs the board and holds majority voting control, especially. Indeed, Zuck cannot be removed by the board without his own consent, since any such moves would require a board vote that he, as chairperson and controlling shareholder, could override by replacing dissenting directors. Another factor in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor is the board composition as well as independence issues. While Meta has added several independent and high-profile directors in recent years, including former politicians, finance executives, and tech CEOs, the reality is that all board members serve Mark Zuckerberg's pleasure at his discretion. He controls their re-election via his voting power, and he has significant influence in choosing new board members. He effectively handpicks or at least approves the slate of directors at the annual general meeting. Some long-tenured board members, such as venture capitalist Mark Andreessen, are known personal friends or loyalists of Zuckerberg's. Others who had more independence, for example, former independent chair Erskine Bowles or Susan Desmond-Hellmann, who was independent director and once lead independent director, have left the board, often without public explanation. The current board includes several fellow tech founders who may be sympathetic to Mark's style of control, and individuals with ties to Mark's philanthropic initiatives. For example, Peggy Alford was CFO of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. While these individuals are qualified, their presence raises questions about boardroom culture. Namely, are they truly going to challenge Mark if necessary? The board has never publicly opposed a major decision of Zuckerberg's. Reports suggest the board's relationship with Mark is collegial, potentially too deferential. For instance, when Zuckerberg pushed to rebrand the company to Meta and pivot to the metaverse strategy, the board unanimously went along, committing billions to this high-risk shift. There was no sign of pushback despite investor skepticism. This suggests a board largely aligned with or acquiescent to the CEO. In governance terms, the board is not an effective check on executive decisions at Meta. Rather, it often appears as an advisory council chosen by the CEO. Another factor under consideration for the executive entrenchment factor includes the lack of corrective action despite performance or crises. Perhaps the clearest evidence of entrenchment is what has not happened in response to crises. Meta has weathered multiple major controversies and setbacks in the last decade. The Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018, which exposed massive misuse of Facebook user data and led to a global outrage for regulatory scrutiny. The use of Facebook foreign actors to interfere in elections, for example, Russian misinformation campaigns in the 2016 U.S. election. The 2018 stock price plunge, where Meta stock fell 25% in one day in February 2018 after a weak forecast erasing $230 billion in market value, one of the largest single-day value losses in stock market history. The whistleblower revelations of 2021, which included internal documents revealing the platform's harms of promoting hate speech, misinformation, negative effects on team mental health, etc., and ongoing stagnation in user growth at times with fierce competition from rivals like TikTok. In many public companies, a combination of these events would put immense pressure on the CEO, possibly leading to their resignation or replacement, or at least a significant change in strategy and leadership structure. At Meta, Mark Zuckerberg remained firmly in control through all of it. There was no serious discussion, at least not that ever became public, of finding a new CEO or even installing an independent chair to guide the company through these storms. Mark apologized for some missteps and pledged improvements, but at no point was his authority or tenure in doubt. The board did not take any publicly visible action to sanction or even formally rebuke him. On the contrary, they re-elected him as board chair each year and continued to endorse his management. Even when Meta's stock price suffered a prolonged slump in 2022 amid doubts about the expensive metaverse pivot, Zuckerberg pressed on with increased spending, and the board rubber-stamped a massive share buyback, which can be seen as a move to boost stock price but also consolidates his relative ownership. The absence of consequence or adjustment in leadership in the face of significant business challenges underscores how deeply entrenched the executive leadership is. Shareholders effectively have no recourse. Even if 92% of shareholders indicated a lack of confidence in Mark's advisory vote, Mark remains CEO and chair with the board's backing. Another factor in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor is the executive compensation and control of information. Zuckerberg's personal compensation has never been an issue. He famously takes $1 salary and has no large stock grants. However, his wealth is in the shares he already owns. Notably, Meta's broader executive team's compensation has faced shareholder criticism. Say-on-pay votes have seen a chunk of outside shareholders vote against, though again never enough to overrule Mark's votes. The board's continued willingness to approve generous pay and perks for the CEO, significant scrutiny costs, and private jet usage paid by the company, recognizing Mark as, quote, critical talent, unquote, suggests they will defer to what Mark believes is needed. Additionally, Mark's entrenchment is such that he controls company information flow. He sets strategy. For example, a sudden announcement of the metaverse focus in 2021 was largely his vision, and the board and investors get information through his lenses. The company's investor communications often highlight metrics that align with Mark's narrative, for example, touting family of apps user numbers when Facebook app usage was plateauing. This subtle control of narrative further cements that stakeholders rely on Mark's perspective and bets. There is not a wide forum for others to impose different metrics or approaches. In aggregate, Meta's executive entrenchment factor of positive 1.90 indicates that Zuckerberg's entrenchment is nearly absolute. It is just a hair shy of the theoretical maximum, because conceivably there are even more extreme scenarios. For instance, if he were both CEO and sole owner of the company, but that would be a private firm scenario. As a public company, Meta sets a high watermark for executive entrenchment. The phrase, quote, autocratic executive power, unquote, from the scoring band is apt. Mark Zuckerberg exercises a level of unchecked power at Meta akin to an autocrat. The governance structure lacks effective safety valves to correct course if the chief executive makes wrong decisions or if a leadership change were in shareholders' best interests. The entrenchment has strategic implications. It allowed Meta to ignore short-term pressures and invest heavily in long-term projects like virtual reality, AI, research, etc., which could have been seen as a positive. But it also means that if those bets are misguided, shareholders have little ability to intervene or demand a change in leadership. The tolerance for risk is essentially whatever Mark's tolerance is. For now, markets have largely accepted this arrangement, perhaps because Zuckerberg delivered enormous growth in the past, but the executive entrenchment factor highlights the governance risk. Meta is as strong or as weak as its leader. A single point of failure or success. Moving on to the fifth and final Proxyopoly TM rating. Underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the regulatory evasion measure. By definition, the regulatory evasion measure gauges how a company navigates and influences external regulatory environment. Essentially, how effectively it evades, mitigates, or shapes regulatory oversight and accountability. A high regulatory evasion measure suggests the company often finds ways to operate with minimal regulatory constraint, whether through lobbying, exploiting jurisdictional loopholes, avoiding transparency, or wielding influence over policymakers. It's not about how legal activity per se. It is about a firm's power to ensure that laws and regulations do not significantly impede its actions, even when its size or impact might warrant stricter oversight. A very high regulatory evasion measure can flag a company that poses systemic risks or negative externalities, but thus far has avoided proportional regulations. Proxyopoly TM has assigned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.40 for Meta's regulatory evasion measure, indicating elevated evasiveness and systemic shadow operations. Meta's regulatory evasion measure is substantially positive, reflecting that Meta has a track record of evading effective regulation and bending the policy environment in its favor. As one of the world's most powerful social media and technology companies, Meta has been at the center of many regulatory debates. From data privacy to antitrust to content moderation, the 1.40 Proxyopoly TM score positively indicates that to date, Meta has largely avoided stringent regulation or severe penalties relative to the outsized influence it wields, thanks to strategic lobbying, legal maneuvers, and at times calculated concessions that stave off bigger interference. Key points to note in the regulatory evasion measure include massive lobbying expenditures and influence. Meta spends extraordinary sums on lobbying governments, particularly in the United States and in the European Union, where most relevant regulations are considered. In 2023, Meta spent about $19.3 million on federal lobbying in the U.S. and hired 71 lobbyists, 85% of whom were former government insiders. This made Meta the top spender among social media firms, outpacing even other big tech peers. The trend continued upward. In the first quarter of 2024 alone, Meta spent a record $7.6 million lobbying the U.S. federal government, more than double what giants like Apple or Google spent in that quarter. The focus of Meta's lobbying efforts has been legislative on data privacy, online safety for children, content moderation rules, and antitrust issues. By developing an army of lobbyists, many with revolving door connections, Meta ensures its voice is loudly heard in any regulatory discussion. This has allowed Meta to shape or stall proposed regulations. For example, comprehensive federal policy legislation in the United States has been debated for years but not passed. Tech lobbying, including Meta's, has influenced details like federal preemption of state laws. Meta has also pushed back on attempts to weaken Section 230 of the U.S. law that gives social platforms immunity from liability for user content, framing itself as a defender of free expression. The result, as of 2025, there is still no federal law significantly restraining Meta's data monetization practices or content algorithms, and Section 230 remains intact, a major regulatory shield for Meta's business model. Another key point for the regulatory evasion measure includes jurisdictional arbitrage and legal maneuvers. Meta has proven adept at leveraging different jurisdictions' laws to its benefit. For instance, after the European Union's strict GDPR privacy regulation took effect in 2018, Meta made adjustments such that non-European users' data were kept under U.S. terms, reducing GDPR's reach to only EU residents. They shifted data agreements for international users from Ireland to the U.S. to avoid broader European Union jurisdiction. In another example, when confronted with a new law in Australia in 2021 that would force Facebook to pay news publishers for content, the News Media Bargaining Code, Meta temporarily blocked all news content on Facebook in Australia, a drastic move that demonstrated its willingness to play hardball. This blackout pressured the Australian government to amend the law in terms more favorable to platforms. Similarly, in 2023, Canada passed a law requiring payment for news content. Meta responded by announcing it would pull news from Facebook and Instagram in Canada rather than comply. These cases show a pattern. Meta often opts to resist and circumvent regulations rather than submit. By leveraging the essential nature of its platform, in some countries, Facebook is a main source of news. Meta can sometimes force regulators to soften their stance, a hallmark of regulatory evasiveness. Another key point underlying the regulatory evasion measure includes capturing the regulatory dialogue. Meta has also taken a proactive approach in shaping regulations by participating in their development. An example is AI and content moderation. Meta's executives, like its president of global affairs, Nick Clegg, a former deputy prime minister in the UK, frequently publish position papers and engage with regulators proposing, quote, frameworks, unquote, for how to regulate areas like harmful content for AI. In doing so, Meta tries to steer the conversation towards self-regulation and voluntary measures instead of hard mandates. This creation of the Independent Oversight Board in 2020 is a case in point. Meta touted this as an, quote, external, unquote, body to review content decisions, perhaps hoping to convince policymakers that a Facebook-funded oversight mechanism could obviate the need for government regulation on content moderation. While the Oversight Board has made some high-profile rulings, like the review of President Trump's account suspension, it ultimately has limited power and exists partly to demonstrate that Meta can police itself. However, this strategy, creating internal governance structures, talking up ethical principles but avoiding binding regulations, is a classic way to fend off stricter external rules. In AI ethics, Meta has an open-sourced approach to some of its artificial intelligence models like LLAMA or Llama, and position itself as transparent compared to closed rivals. Possibly to argue that heavy artificial intelligence regulation would stifle the kind of openness Meta is supposedly championing. By taking these stances, Meta attempts to keep regulators at bay, or at least heavily influence the regulatory outcome in directions it can live with. Another key point in the regulatory evasion measure includes regulatory enforcement history at Meta. Meta has faced fines and legal actions, but considering its scale, many observers note these have been relatively ineffectual or absorbed as the cost of doing business. The most notable penalty was the $5 billion fine by the United States Federal Trade Commission in 2019 for privacy violations related to Cambridge Analytica. While $5 billion is record-setting fine-wise in absolute terms, it amounted to under 10% of Meta's annual revenue. A figurative slap on the wrist for a company of Meta's size. Importantly, that Federal Trade Commission settlement, while imposing some new compliance measures like forming a board privacy committee and regular privacy audits, did not significantly hinder Meta's core data-driven ad business. Meta's stock price actually rose on the news of the $5 billion fine because investors were relieved it wasn't more onerous. In the European Union, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever, has been fined multiple times by Ireland's Data Protection Commission, including a recent €1.2 billion fine in 2023 for violating European Union data transfer rules. Yet, Meta is appealing these decisions and still pursuing ways to legally transfer European Union data to the US, benefiting from an anticipated new EU-US data framework. The company has shown that it can absorb fines and delay compliance through lengthy legal appeals without fundamentally changing its business model. This pattern, large-scale harms or rule bending leading to fines, but the company proceeding largely as before, indicates that enforcement has not materially altered Meta's behavior or structure. Meta has so far avoided any penalty or injunction that would, say, limit its ability to collect data or force divestiture of a major part of its business. Even antitrust efforts have yet to slow Meta, with the Federal Trade Commission's attempt to block Meta's acquisition of a VR company, named Within, was defeated in court in early 2023, allowing Meta to continue expanding in the VR space. No antitrust breakup has materialized, despite calls to separate Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Meta remains essentially intact and free to pursue dominance in new domains, VR, messaging, AI, with minimal regulatory restriction. Another key point in the regulatory evasion measure includes externalization of risk and limited liability. Part of Meta's regulatory evasion is thanks to legal regimes that favor it, notably Section 230 in the U.S., which gives it immunity for user post content. Meta has vigorously defended this immunity in courts and public opinion. The result is that, Unlike traditional publishers, Meta largely escapes liability for harmful content disseminated on its platforms, shifting the burden of policing misinformation or hate speech onto third-party fact-checkers, civil society, or governments. When societal harms occur, for example, election misinformation, incitement of violence via social media in certain countries, Meta executives apologize or tweak policies, but the company itself has by and large avoided legal accountability for these harms. This externalization means the public or government picks up the costs in fractured discourse, need for laws, etc., while Meta continues its profit-driven engagement model. From a regulatory evasion measure standpoint, this is a form of regulatory gap exploitation, taking full advantage of laws that shield the company from responsibility and lobbying to keep those laws intact. Another key point underlying the regulatory evasion measure includes shifting public perception incremental compliance measures. It should be noted that regulatory pressure on Meta is mounting. Our regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.40 reflects the landscape up to early 2025, where Meta has been highly evasive. However, we do see regulators now starting to move. For example, the European Union's Digital Services Act came into force in 2023, requiring very large online platforms like Meta to be more transparent and accountable for content moderation and algorithmic impacts. Meta has had to implement some changes under this Digital Service Act, like giving users an option to see a chronological feed not driven by personalized algorithms and sharing data with researchers. Additionally, the FTC in 2023 proposed modifying its 2019 consent order to bar Meta from monetizing data of minors after alleging Meta misled parents, a sign that U.S. regulators are trying to tighten oversight after past settlements proved insufficient. These developments suggest Meta's ability to evade might be slightly decreasing, but as of this report, Meta's overall regulatory burden still does not commensurate with its influence. The company remains a systemically important global communications platform that largely writes its own rules. Its regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.40 reflects that Meta continues to find ways to avoid the brunt of regulation, whether through proactive lobbying, outspending peers to shape laws, leveraging its platform power in negotiations as seen in Australia, Canada, new standoffs, or making calculated minimal concessions to appease regulators without altering its profit regimes. In summary, Meta's high regulatory evasion measure score indicates a company extremely skilled at playing the regulatory game to its advantage. It has exploited legislative gray areas, influenced policymakers, and borne only light regulatory touch relative to its significant external impacts. This has short-term benefits, freedom to innovate and operate, with high margins, but it's a double-edged sword. The lack of external checks contributed to crises like Cambridge Analytica and the spread of harmful content, which in turn invite harsher future regulation. A regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.40 is a warning sign that Meta's power has outpaced the current regulatory framework. The company operates to a degree in the shadows of full accountability, which is precisely what Proxyopoly TM and its framework has flagged. Stakeholders should be aware that changes in policy and political will or public sentiment could bring a regulatory reckoning. In the meantime, Meta strategists will undoubtedly continue to do everything possible to delay or dilute such oversight. And before we dive into part 3 of this podcast, where we discuss the policy change recommendations and board voting recommendations for the upcoming annual general meeting of Meta Platforms, going to give an opportunity to let the Proxyopolist at home take a break. We could plug some sponsored content here. or maybe some contributed content from the Proxyopolis to home. You can contact Proxyopoly today if you want by selecting the Contact Proxyopoly option at the link tree. But if you're just at home taking a huge, massive shit and listening to this podcast, Proxyopoly isn't going to tell you what toilet paper to wipe your asses with. No. Proxyopoly instead is going to tell you can read this Proxyopoly TM research report by selecting the Patreon option on the link tree, and that link tree again is linktree/nascarcosa. Without any further delay, having assessed Meta's governance through the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings, it is clear that while the company's structure has enabled remarkable stability and founder-driven vision, it also poses significant risks and drawbacks for shareholders and stakeholders. In this final part, we provide recommendations to address the imbalances identified, and we offer voting recommendations for each member of Meta's board of directors to guide shareholders in the upcoming annual general meeting. Governance reforms and policy recommendations by Proxyopoly TM. To move Meta platforms toward a more balanced and accountable governance model, and thereby reduce its Proxyopoly TM score over time, Proxyopoly TM recommends several key reforms and initiatives. Proxyopoly TM policy recommendation number 1. Phase out the dual-class share structure. The single most impactful change would be to introduce a plan to sunset Meta's dual-class shares. This could entail converting Class B shares into Class A on a one-on-one basis after a certain date or event. For example, in 5 years, or if Mark Zuckerberg's ownership falls below a certain threshold. Adopting a, quote, one share, one vote, unquote, system over time would greatly restore shareholder democracy by improving the proxy accumulation resistance and the Bylaw Fortification Index, thus showing that Meta is committed to long-term governance best practices. Many founder-led companies such as Google and Alphabet have resisted this, but others have voluntarily eliminated dual-class structures after growth phases. Given Meta's maturity, continuing to concentrate votes so heavily is neither necessary nor sustainable. We recommend the board negotiate with Class B holders, primarily Zuck, to agree on a reasonable sunset timeline. Even a distant sunset or a commitment to put the dual class to a shareholder vote periodically would be progress. Eliminating the dual class would immediately empower outside investors and ensure that in the future, management stays responsive to all shareholders, not just the founder. Another Proxyopoly TM policy recommendation, number 2, appoint an independent board chair. Meta should separate the roles of chief executive officer and chair of the board. An independent, non-executive chair should be appointed to lead the board of directors, while Mark Zuckerberg, if he remains CEO, can focus on running the company day to day. This governance split is considered a best practice to ensure the board can provide genuine oversight of management. An independent chair or alternatively rotated lead director with real powers would set board agendas, convene meetings of independent directors, and serve as a check on CEO authority in the boardroom. This change directly addresses the extreme executive entrenchment factor and shareholder hostility quotient ratings. It would formalize a check on executive entrenchment and signal that shareholder concerns will get a fair hearing at the board level. We recognize Mark Zuckerberg's contributions, but even visionary founders benefit from oversight and guidance that an independent chair can provide. The board should initiate a search for a chairperson with no prior ties to management. Possibly one of the current independent directors could step into this role. Namely, Robert Kimmett, given his experience as lead independent director, could be a possible candidate for chair. However, over time, this separation will also help CEO succession planning and company longevity. Proxyopoly TM Policy Recommendation Number 3 empowered the lead independent director immediately. In the interim, while the above roles are being deliberated, the chair and CEO, Meta should implement the reform that shareholders sought in 2024. Give the lead independent director the explicit power to add items to the board agenda and call special board meetings. This change can be done via a board resolution or a minority bylaw amendment. It would ensure that if independent directors feel an issue, say a potential conflict of interest, a crisis, or a governance concern exists and needs board attention, it cannot be unilaterally blocked by the chair CEO. Zuck! Essentially, it is a safeguard for the board's autonomy. This recommendation is in line with what a majority of outside shareholders already supported, and adopting it proactively would demonstrate goodwill. It would likely lead to more fulsome board discussions on governance, risk, and strategy, areas where perhaps directors have felt constrained. Such empowerment might have allowed, for instance, earlier board-level discussions of controversies like Cambridge Analytica or election interference, potentially prompting swifter action. It is a common-sense governance improvement that Meta should enact. Proxyopoly TM Policy Recommendation Number 4, enhance board composition and oversight. The board should continue the refreshment it began in late 2024 and early 2025. Focusing on adding truly independent directors with expertise in areas vital to Meta's future and stakeholder concerns. Recent additions such as prominent fintech CEO, a former government official, and international business leaders are a positive step. We recommend further diversity of experience. Bring in a director with strong credentials in AI ethics or data privacy, someone who has perhaps led an AI ethics council or has regulatory expertise in privacy. This expertise on the board can help Meta navigate the complex decisions on AI development, for example, weighing openness versus safety in AI model release, and ensure privacy considerations are ingrained in product development. Similarly, a director with a background in content moderation, journalism, or civil rights could provide valuable perspectives on misinformation and platform abuse issues, which historically have not been areas of expertise for the board. Tenure and independence review to set term limits or at least conduct rigorous evaluations for long-tenured directors. For an instance, Mark Andreessen has been on the board since 2008, over 15 years. Long tenure can compromise independence. The board should consider a policy that after over 12 years, directors will not be renominated unless special circumstances. This would open up slots for fresh independent voices over time. We specifically recommend considering rotation of any directors whose close personal or business relationships with management might impair impartial oversight. For example, those who have overlapping investments or long friendships with Zuck. Committee strengthening the compensation, nominating, and governance committee should be chaired by a strong independent voice, not an insider or friend of Mark Zuckerberg's, and tasked with formally exploring these governance changes. Dual class sunset, independent chair, etc. The privacy and product compliance committee should deliver routine reports to the full board and possibly include external expert advisors in its meetings, given the complexity of privacy, compliance, and product risk. We also suggest the board consider forming a technology and risk committee that specifically oversees risks from Meta's algorithms, AI projects, and platform misuse, thereby institutionalizing attention to the issues that regulators and the public are concerned about. This could overlap with the Privacy Committee or be a new one. Either way, dedicating board-level focus on systemic risks and Meta's technology, similar to how banks have risk committees, would demonstrate proactive governance. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM Policy Recommendation Number 5, improve shareholder communication and responsiveness. Meta should take concrete steps to reduce the shareholder hostility quotient by being more responsive to reasonable shareholder requests. This can include pledging implementation of widely supported proposals. For example, if a shareholder proposal receives majority support of Class A shares, the public shareholders, even if it fails due to Mark Zuckerberg's Class B shares, the board could voluntarily commit to consider it as if it passed. This policy would respect the will of independent shareholders and could be applied to non-binding resolutions. A case in point, the proposal for greater disclosures of voting outcomes by class. The board could simply agree to provide that information in future proxy statements, acknowledging the desire for transparency. Doing so would cost nothing and would build trust. Regular investor engagements on environmental, social, and governance issues would also improve shareholder communication and responsiveness. Initiating an annual investor governance forum where top management and directors meet with major shareholders, including public pension funds and advocacy groups, specifically to discuss governance, environmental, social governance issues, and shareholder concerns outside of the earnings financial context. This would signal that Meta's leadership is listening. Questions on contentious issues like misinformation or handling of data use could be addressed in dialogue, potentially yielding suggestions that management can adopt voluntarily. It's easier to be hostile than faceless to proposals which would yield actual discussions with shareholders. Increasing those discussions may soften management's stance and lead to collaborative solutions. Transparency and reporting might also improve the shareholder hostility quotient. Meta can actively release reports on some of the issues shareholders care about, preempting the need for formal proposals. For instance, publishing an annual data privacy and security report detailing compliance efforts, or a content enforcement report, which Meta does some of this already in its community standards report, but it could be expanded. By voluntarily providing this information, such as an external audit of its civil rights or a summary of its lobbying priorities, Meta can reduce shareholder suspicion and meet some proposals' demands halfway. This approach has worked for other companies to get proponents to withdraw solutions in exchange for voluntary disclosures. Proxyopoly TM policy recommendation number 6, align executive incentives with accountability. The board's compensation committee should consider updating executive compensation structures to include metrics tied to user trust, data security, and content safety, not just financial and growth metrics. For example, a portion of executives' bonuses could be tied to achieving certain privacy protection milestones, like successful completion of external data audits with no major issues, or reducing the prevalence of harmful content as measured by independent assessments. By quantifying and rewarding progress on these non-financial but critical areas, Meta signals internally and externally that it values addressing the externalities of the platform. Such alignments could also mollify shareholders who worry that leadership is too focused on growth at the expense of ethics. It effectively embeds some environmental, social, governance objectives into leadership's own goals. Moreover, we recommend the company disclose more about its succession planning, even just high-level assurances. While Mark Zuckerberg may remain in the role for the foreseeable future, shareholders take comfort in knowing the board periodically reviews emergency and long-term succession plans for the CEO and key executives. Detailing this in the proxy statement without names, which is often sensitive, would show the board is fulfilling its duty to prepare the future of the company for the unexpected, thereby slightly reducing entrenchment concerns. Proxyopoly TM recommendation for policy changes number 7, embrace proactive regulation and ethical leadership. Rather than expending energy purely on fighting regulation, Meta could pivot to responsible innovation, working with regulators to craft sensible rules and voluntarily adhering to higher standards. For example, Meta could publicly commit to following key principles of pending artificial intelligence legislation like the European Union's AI Act globally, even before it is law. This would set a tone that Meta wants to be an industry leader in ethical AI development, not a laggard. Similarly, Meta could endorse federal privacy legislation that provides stronger user rights rather than quietly lobbying to water it down. By taking a more cooperative stance, Meta might reduce the adversarial relationship it has with regulators and avoid reputational damage from being seen as an obstructor. In practice, this means dialing back pure evasion tactics and instead investing in compliance infrastructure. For instance, rather than appealing every European Union privacy fight ad nauseum, Meta could announce a new initiative to meet the spirit of EU privacy law across all its platforms, perhaps earning goodwill with European regulators and potentially influencing global standards in a way Meta can handle. Essentially, Meta is now so large and systemically important that it should act less like a nimble startup trying to move fast and break things, and more like a responsible incumbent that accepts regulation as a part of the landscape. Long term, this can reduce the risk of extremely harsh regulation or even antitrust breakup, as Meta demonstrates it can regulate itself effectively. Proxyopoly recommendation policy change number 8. Establish an external ethics advisory council to guide Meta on the thorniest issues such as artificial intelligence ethics, misinformation, political influence, etc. The company should form a permanent advisory council of external experts. This body, separate from the oversight board, would consist of respected academics, former regulators, civil society leaders in fields like artificial intelligence, ethics, human rights, and child development. Their mandate: regularly review meta strategies and products for ethical and societal impact to make public recommendations for the board. Crucially, the board should commit seriously to consider these changes and recommendations to integrate them when feasible. This adds an additional layer of accountability, an external conscience, so to speak. It can help foresee problems such as potential biases in AI, upcoming election misinformation threats, and so on, to address them before they blow up. While such councils exist in some form at companies, Meta has had ad hoc groups, giving it teeth by linking it directly to the board deliberations, which would strengthen Meta's governance ecosystem. It's a way of bringing outside stakeholder voices into the corporate decision-making in a structured manner, which could partially counterbalance insular decision processes flagged by Proxyopoly's shareholder hostility quotient and executive entrenchment factor analysis. If Meta's leadership heeds outside experts, it might avoid mistakes that lead to public outcry or regulatory wrath, thus protecting long-term shareholder value. Implementing these recommendations will not happen overnight. Some require Mark Zuckerberg's buy-in, which is a governance challenge in itself. However, even incremental progress on a few of them could start to lower Meta's overall Proxyopoly TM ratings. For example, agreeing to an independent chair would immediately improve executive entrenchment factor and shareholder hostility quotient. Committing to a dual-class sunset would eventually vastly improve proxy accumulation, resistance, and bylaw fortification index. Better transparency and cooperation would chip away at the shareholder hostility quotient and regulatory evasion measure. These moves would reassure shareholders that Meta is addressing the very real governance concerns that exist, without compromising the innovative drive that makes the company successful. In fact, many of these changes could enhance Meta's innovation by creating a more sustainable foundation of trust and accountability. For example, being a leader in ethical artificial intelligence might attract talent and avoid costly scandals. We believe Meta is at a crossroads where it can continue down the path of maximal insider control with increasing controversy and regulatory risk, or evolve its governance to be more inclusive and resilient. These recommendations above and beyond chart a path to the latter. Next, we move on to the final section of this podcast, which I am always very stoked about, the Board of Directors voting recommendations for the upcoming annual general meeting of Meta Platforms. And then we'll reveal the final Proxyopoly score. In the context of the upcoming shareholder meeting and the election of directors, Proxyopoly TM provides the following vote recommendations for each current Meta board member. These recommendations are based on Proxyopoly TM analysis from parts 1 and 2, you can rewind if you want, and evaluate which directors are likely to steer Meta toward a better governance versus which may be impeding progress. Proxyopoly TM considers factors such as independence, tenure, contributions or lack thereof to oversight, and any conflicts of interest or alignment with the entrenched status quo. Shareholders of Meta can use this as a guidance to cast votes that support a more accountable and effective board of directors for Meta platforms. The first board member on the docket for which Proxyopoly TM is publishing a vote recommendation is founder, chairperson, and CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Zuck at Meta Platform's upcoming annual general meeting. As founder, chair, CEO, Zuck holds unparalleled power at Meta but has resisted governance improvements. Voting against his re-election as director sends a clear message. Shareholders seek an independent board leadership structure and greater accountability. While Mark's vision has driven Meta's success, his dual role and majority control have enabled extreme entrenchment and the dismissal of shareholder concerns. For example, opposing independent chair proposals, a vote against or even withholding support from Zuckerberg at the annual general meeting registers concern about the current imbalance of power and the need for Meta to separate the roles of chairperson and CEO for robust oversight. We acknowledge that he will be re-elected anyway due to his voting control from dual-class shares, the Class B shares, which hold 10-1 voting power, but a strong vote against by outside shareholders sends an important message. Moving on to the next board of director on the docket, we have Peggy Alford. Director since 2019, former CFO of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Miss Alford at the upcoming annual general meeting of Meta. While Miss Alford brings financial expertise to the board, she has close ties to Mark Zuckerberg, having worked as CEO of his personal philanthropy, and thus is not perceived as fully independent. She serves on key committees, audit and risk, and she is chair of compensation and governance committees. Yet, under her tenure, those committees have not pushed for any significant governance reforms, implying acquiescence to the status quo. Given her personal and professional connection to the founder, shareholders should question her ability to objectively hold management accountable. A vote against encourages refreshing the seat with a truly independent director with no conflicts. Next on the docket for board of director elections, we have Mark L. Andreessen. Director since 2008, a venture capitalist. Proxyopoly TM has a voting recommendation of against. On the rationale, Mr. Andreessen is a long-tenured director for 17 years at Meta and a known ally of Zuckerberg. His venture capital background was valuable early in Meta's growth years, but over time, his role in several controversial decisions, for example, reportedly supporting Zuckerberg's proposal for a now-aborted new class of non-voting shares in 2019, shows alignment with management at the expense of regular shareholders. His prolonged tenure raises concern about independence. After nearly 2 decades on the board, his objectivity and fresh perspectives are limited. Moreover, Andreessen has not championed shareholder-friendly changes. Instead, he often provides an echo for management's views. Voting against his re-election would signal the need for board refreshment and greater independence. Next on the docket for the election of board of directors, we have John H. Arnold, director since 2002, co-chair Arnold Ventures, former hedge fund manager. Proxyopoly TM has a voting recommendation of 4 on the rationale that Mr. Arnold is relatively new to the board and brings background in public policy engagement and philanthropy. As an outsider with no prior ties to Meta's management, he has the potential to provide independent oversight. His experience in advocating for transparency and accountability through his foundation, Arnold Ventures, is a plus for Meta's governance. There have been no red flags in his short tenure. Thus, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Mr. Arnold in the belief that he can be a constructive, independent voice pushing Meta toward better practices. Next on the docket for director elections, we have Patrick Collison, director since 2025, co-founder and CEO of Stripe. Proxyopoly has a recommendation to vote for Mr. Collison on the grounds that he is a newly appointed director, having joined in April 2025. As a successful tech founder outside of Meta, he brings a fresh perspective on innovation and may empathize with, but not be beholden to, Zuck. While also a CEO, Collison has a track record of thoughtful leadership. Stripe is known for a strong culture and shareholder/stakeholder focus. Crucially, he enters without entanglements at Meta and can look at issues like privacy and artificial intelligence with an independent mind. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Mr. Collison to give him the opportunity to contribute to needed board deliberations. His presence alone diversifies board thinking, and shareholders should monitor his independence, but at this stage, support is merited. Next on the docket for Board of Director elections, we have John Elkin, director since 2025, CEO XRNV. Proxyopoly TM has a voting recommendation of 4 on the grounds that Mr. Elkin, as head of a major holding company and scion of a family with its own controlled companies, brings a seasoned investor viewpoint. He is experienced in balancing long-term vision with accountability given Exor's public company holdings. Importantly, he is new and has no prior allegiance to Meta's management. Elkin's global business acumen and independent stature suggest he can exercise sound judgment on Meta's board. Proxyopoly therefore recommends voting for Mr. Elkin at the upcoming annual general meeting. His inclusion is likely to broaden strategic oversight. While he may philosophically understand founder control, given his Fiat XOR background, we expect he will still act in XOR's interests as a shareholder, which aligns in robust governance. The next board of director on the docket we have up for re-election is Andrew W. Houston, or Drew, director since 2020, co-founder and CEO of Dropbox. Proxyopoly TM has a voting recommendation of against on the grounds that Mr. Houston was invited onto the board likely due to his personal rapport with Zuckerberg, as both are young tech founders. While he is an accomplished entrepreneur, his independence is questionable. He and Mark have a friendly relationship, and Houston's own company has dual-class share structure as well, meaning he may be sympathetic to entrenchment strategies. Over his 3+ years on the board, we have not seen evidence of him advocating for shareholder interests or challenging management's approach. Additionally, as sitting as CEO of Dropbox, his capacity to deeply engage in Meta's oversight is limited, raising concerns about overboarding and time commitment. Proxyopoly TM therefore advises a vote against Mr. Houston, and the board seat could be better filled by someone without such close ties to Zuckerberg and with more governance bandwidth. Next up on the docket for Board of Director elections, we have Nancy Killefer, director since 2020, former senior partner at McKinsey, former U.S. Treasury official. Proxyopoly TM has a voting recommendation of 4 on the rationale that Ms. Killefer appears to be a strongly independent director with a background in consulting and government that equips her to question management and focus on organizational effectiveness. She chairs the Privacy and Product Compliance Committee, a crucial role mandated by the FTC settlement, and her leadership there is important for steering Meta's improvements in privacy and user protection. Killefer's experience and oversight, when she oversaw the IRS improvements in the past, is highly valuable as Meta navigates regulatory scrutiny. By all accounts, she has no conflicts of interest and has been an active contributor. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Ms. Killefer at the upcoming annual general meeting of Meta Platforms. because retaining Ms. Killefer supports continuity in a much-needed compliance oversight for the board. Next on the docket, we have Robert M. Kimmett, previously mentioned on the podcast, director since 2020, the lead independent director, former U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary. Proxyopoly TM has a recommendation to vote for Mr. Kimmett at the upcoming annual general meeting of Meta Platforms on the grounds that Ambassador Kimmett serves as the lead independent director and thus is a key figure in trying to counterbalance Zuckerberg's control. He has extensive diplomatic and board experience and has been a proponent of enhancing board processes. Indeed, the 2024 proposal to empower the lead independent director was effectively to strengthen his role. Kimmett's continued presence is important for independent oversight. He is the primary conduit for shareholder concerns to the board. Although his influence has limits, removing him could weaken independent leadership. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM strongly recommends voting for Mr. Kimmett to maintain a seasoned, assertive, independent voice at the head of independent directors. Next on the docket for election to the board of directors, or re-election rather, is Dina Powell McCormick. Director since 2025, executive at BDT and MSD Capital, former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor. Proxyopoly TM has a voting recommendation of 4 on the grounds that Ms. Powell McCormick is another newly added director with a distinguished career in finance and government. She brings geopolitical and risk perspective, given her national security background, which is invaluable as Meta deals with global issues, for example, censorship demands, misinformation campaigns, etc. She is independent of management and can add a fresh set of eyes on Meta strategy and reputation. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Ms. Powell McCormick and her re-election to the board of directors in anticipation that she will bolster the board's oversight capabilities, especially in areas like corporate diplomacy and regulatory navigation, without being beholden to Zuck. Next up on the docket for re-election to the board of directors, we have Charlie Songhurst. Director since 2025, technology investor, former Microsoft strategist. Proxyopoly TM has a voting recommendation of 4 Mr. Songhurst on the grounds that appointed in late 2024, he is an independent tech investor with strategic planning expertise. He's relatively young and brings insight on tech trends and competitive strategies. Importantly, he has no prior ties to Meta's leadership. Songhurst's background at Microsoft, which went through its own antitrust and regulatory challenges, could inform Meta's approach to similar issues. Therefore, Proxyopoly suggests a vote for Mr. Songhurst. As a newcomer, he deserves shareholder support, and his independent investor mindset aligns with shareholder interests, namely value creation with accountability. Next on the docket, we have Hockey Tan for the re-election to board of directors, a director since 2020, CEO of Broadcom Inc. as well. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for Mr. Tan as a seasoned leader of a major tech company and has been an independent director on Meta's board for a few years. He provides a hard-nosed business and financial perspective. Broadcom is known for efficiency and shareholder returns. Tan has no known conflicts of interest with Meta's management and brings valuable experience in mergers and acquisitions, also global operations. One could argue his simultaneous CEO role makes him busy or overboarded, but he has thus far maintained his commitment, and Broadcom's success suggests he manages time well. Proxyopoly leans toward voting for Mr. Tan at the upcoming annual general meeting, as his perspective as an outside technology CEO and operator is beneficial to the board's diversity of thought. He has the stature to speak up if something is amiss and no incentive to simplify or simply rubber stamp. Next on the docket for re-election to the board of directors, we have Tracy T. Travis. Director since 2020, CFO of the Estee Lauder Companies. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Ms. Travis as she is an experienced CFO of a global company and serves as chair of Meta's Audit and Risk Oversight Committee. Her financial acumen and risk management focus are critical for a company of Meta's size. By all accounts, she is independent and has been diligent in her duties, ensuring financial transparency and oversight of internal controls. Given Meta's significant investments and expenditures, Reality Labs, etc., having Travis's disciplined financial oversight is very valuable to shareholders. We recommend at Proxyopoly that shareholders vote for her re-election to continue benefiting from her expertise and steady hand on audit/risk matters. Next on the docket, up for re-election to the board of directors of Meta Platforms is Dana White, director since 2025, CEO of UFC. Proxyopoly TM leans toward a recommendation to vote for Mr. White as a new addition to the board. While an unconventional choice coming from the sports and entertainment world, he is an independent and brings an entrepreneurial mindset. He has built a global brand of UFC and can contribute perspective on media, branding, and perhaps the creator economy. Relevant as Meta expands into the metaverse content. There is some concern that he lacks public company board experience, but his outsider status means he's likely to ask blunt questions and think differently than the Silicon Valley norm. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for, giving Dana White a chance to prove himself as an independent director who can add value. In early votes, support helps integrate him. If over time he doesn't contribute to governance improvements, that vote for can be reassessed at a later date and time. Last on the docket, we have Tony Zhu up for election to the board of directors. Director since 2022, co-founder and CEO of DoorDash. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Mr. Zhu. Like Mr. Houston, he is a peer of Mark Zuckerberg, brought onto the board during a recent refresh. As the CEO of DoorDash, he is another active executive, which means limited time for Meta oversight. More importantly, Zhu's own company has a dual-class share structure controlled by its founders, indicating that he may be philosophically aligned with founder-friendly governance and less inclined to advocate Meta's reform. In his 2 years on Meta's board, we have not seen notable contributions from Zhu in terms of governance changes or public engagement. There is a risk he too serves as a young tech ally who reinforces Zuck's viewpoints. To encourage a board composition more focused on independent oversight rather than tech industry camaraderie, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Tony Zhu's re-election. His seat could be filled by someone with more availability and inclination to champion regular shareholders' interests. Having thus concluded the voting recommendations for the board of directors at the upcoming annual general meeting of Meta Platforms, these recommendations aim to tilt the board's composition toward a majority of directors who are independent, accountable, and capable of steering Meta in a direction that balances innovation with oversight. In summary, Proxyopoly TM urges support for directors who have demonstrated independence or are newly independent in opposition to those who represent the old guard of close allies or entrenched interests. If shareholders collectively follow these recommendations, the likely outcome, even though Zuckerberg's votes with dual-class shares ultimately decide the election, will be a strong signal of investor preference. For instance, significant withhold or against votes for Zuckerberg, Andreessen, Alford, Houston, and Zhu would indicate that outside shareholders who represent the economic ownership of the company want change. Even if those directors are formally re-elected due to the voting structure, such an outcome often influences board thinking. Directors who receive low outside support often take that feedback seriously and may adjust their approach or even step down in the future. Finally, we note that since Mark Zuckerberg controls the majority of votes, the board election is not in question for him or any director he firmly backs. Thus, the voting recommendations are less about the immediate result and more about sending a message and building long-term pressure. We have already seen that when a majority of outside shareholders voice dissatisfaction, for example, the 92% non-insider disapproval in 2022, it puts issues on the map and can lead to gradual change. For example, Meta has been adding new independent directors, arguably in response to investor pressure. By following the above recommendations, shareholders can collectively push Meta toward the governance enhancements outlined in their recommendations. The goal is a Meta platform that retains its innovative edge and founder-driven long-term vision while shedding the aspects of Proxyopoly, that there are no longer serving shareholders or society, namely extreme concentration of power, lack of accountability, and an adversarial stance toward oversight. Concluding note: Meta's final Proxyopoly TM score. Final Proxyopoly score of positive 0.95, which reflects a company at a governance crossroads. The analysis in this report shows that Meta's strengths, visionary leadership, unified direction, and resilient control are double-edged swords that come with weaknesses: insularity, sluggish response to stakeholder concerns, and regulatory risks. By implementing the recommended reforms and heeding shareholder voting signals, Meta's board can begin to rebalance the scales. The company has the opportunity to evolve from a founder-controlled empire to a more transparent, accountable, and broadly governed enterprise without sacrificing performance. Such evolution is not only possible, but has precedence in corporate history. It ultimately may secure Meta's legacy and growth far beyond the clinging to the current Proxyopoly norms. Shareholders, through their votes and engagement, play a pivotal role in guiding Meta along this path. The recommendations herein serve as a roadmap for that journey, one that leads to a lower Proxyopoly TM score and a higher standard of corporate governance at Meta platforms. Thus concludes the Proxyopoly score for Meta. Thanks for tuning in, Proxyopolis. Once again, as a final disclaimer, the Proxyopoly score is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world events are purely coincidental, but with Meta's current corporate governance trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than anticipated. Thanks for tuning in, Proxyopolis. And once again, if it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopolying. Corporate governance, Proxyopoly, shareholder meetings, boards of directors, bylaws old there, older than charters, younger than the podcast, business and finance, proxy votes, count them all to bring change to the bone. Proxyopoly, it's a podcast in business and finance. Proxyopoly.